Seeking justice for rape victims in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Soldiers stand trial in the first case of its kind. But what's being done to address the wider problem of sexual violence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It's a crime that the UN says represents a stain on our collective conscience, a stain that grows with each new rape committed. Sexual violence is endemic in society in general, but it's as a weapon of war that the crime has gone largely unpunished. In the first trial of its kind in the Democratic Republic of Congo, 39 soldiers have been charged with rape. They were among thousands of government troops who fled to the town of Minova when M23 rebels took the provincial capital of Goma in North Kivu province in November 2012. It's here that the women were raped. The precise number is still not known. Malcolm Webb reports.
This woman says when she was 16, rebels abducted her and kept her prisoner for 6 months, raping her repeatedly. When she escaped, she was pregnant. In November 2012, just a few months after giving birth, things got even worse.
We heard that government soldiers were coming and were looting. 17 of them came into where we were hiding. There were 14 of us, and they raped all of us. After they finished, one of them took my baby boy. I found him the next day, but later he died.
She's one of dozens of women who say they were raped at the same time in the same town in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The soldiers were retreating along this road that follows the shore of Lake Kivu after being defeated by the M23 rebels. Almost a year later, under mounting international pressure, 39 of the suspects were charged before a military court in the first case of its kind in Congo. Perpetrators rarely stand trial. Dieudonné Bahati works with victims of sexual violence. He says sentences are rarely upheld and the impunity means the attacks continue.
You act like you're arresting someone and later you find him out and about. The rape victim will feel unsafe because officials said he was arrested, but you find him walking down the street. He's sentenced for some years and after a few weeks he's out.
And the military court in the DRC has delivered its verdict. Only 2 of those accused of rape have been convicted. Well, let's bring in our guests to discuss these issues. In New York, toZainab Hawa Bangura, the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict. From London, Victoria Dove Dimandja, co-founder of the Congolese women's group in the UK, who runs the It Must Stop campaign. And from The Hague, Brigid Inder, Executive Director of the Women's Initiative for Gender Justice. Welcome to you all. Let's begin at the United Nations with toZainab Bangura. Sentence has been passed on the case in the DRC, a case that the UN and yourself has been closely following. What's your immediate reaction to that verdict?
As you know very well, since 2008, when the Security Council adopted a resolution to say that sexual violence in conflicts is an international peace and security issue, we've been putting pressure with government to make sure that they try to end impunity, not only at the ICC, where several attempts have been made to indict heads of state, but at the national level. In most cases, the judicial system has collapsed. The rule of law is not operational. So the DRC is the best example where we have tried as a United Nations to support the justice system, to actually deploy experts that will be able to make sure that people who commit sexual violence are prosecuted. And I think the Minova trial is an example in case. We're using the mobile system structure, which is being supported by the United Nations, to actually take justice on the ground to the people where the crimes have been committed. So that's why we're exceptionally happy that at least the trials on the Minova cases is taking place.
Well, Victoria Dimandja, I mean, the merits of this trial notwithstanding, the point is, as toZainab Bangura said there, the trial did take place. Is this in a way a turning point for governments to deal with endemic violence and rape?
this trial is not really addressing the root causes of the problem, because as we are all aware, that the sexual violence started occurring in the Congo in the late 90s. So the perpetrators of the rapes since the late 90s have not been convicted yet. And those who have been convicted lately are just the one who just followed their colleagues in the army perpetrating rapes against women in the Congo. So we are not really happy with what is happening, because we know many of perpetrators of the sexual violence have been rewarded with high-ranking position in the army and the other institutions in the Congo. So those are just few of them, but we know others are just free as roaming in the street, as free as they are. So this trial is not really, as Congolese women, we are not really satisfied with the trials. And we know that main perpetrators of sexual violence are even in the government. And the government itself is in breach of human rights and is not protecting its population. So it's really not satisfying as well for us as Congolese women.
Well, Brigid, Inder, the whole issue of the systematic nature of cases that we are looking at in Minova, for example, but many others in the past, is that it is not just a case of individuals carrying out acts of violence against women. It appears to be a much wider and much more deep-rooted, systematic, organized expression of power, is it not?
Yes, I think that's a very good description of it. I think rape and sexual violence are very well established and legitimized forms of expressing dominance and superiority, and they are therefore very effective tools to use in an armed conflict to terrorize the community, to enforce, to be dominant, to enforce superiority, to claim military victories. This is a while it's important that there are domestic cases and international cases promoting and supporting accountability. Sometimes the verdicts can be disappointing, and I'm sure the victim survivors involved in this case will be disappointed. The work of the Congolese government in some respects is to be congratulated. They have pursued these cases. They have a very good Sexual Violence Act, but there is a gap, an impunity gap, between the current efforts, both at the grassroots level and nationally, and the kind of satisfactory justice that victim survivors are looking for, including, and in particular, survivors of gender-based forms of violence.
Well, Victoria Dimandja, I just want to pick up on what you were saying as well. You still see the gap that Brigid Inder was referring there to in terms of the stated intentions of a government to create a system of accountability for crimes like rape. You believe that this gap is still too great, that the gap between saying we are going to do it and demand accountability and actually doing it is still too wide in places like the DRC?
There is much more to be done as with regard to holding accountable all perpetrators of sexual violence in the DRC. And the government has a great role to play in holding accountable all those perpetrators of rapes. Yes, there is a huge gap in saying it and doing what they are saying. It's a huge gap, and a lot more to be done yet.
Well, Victoria Dimandja, the fact, as you stated right at the outset, is that it is happening. It might be because of international pressure, including that of the United Nations, but the DRC government has brought a group of people, a group of soldiers, to trial for the first time in the DRC itself. Is this, once again, notwithstanding the verdict in this particular case, a cause for, if not celebration, at least the belief that there is a movement forward in dealing with this issue?
As I said, as Congolese women, we not see really any reason for celebrating, because we know that many numerous of perpetrators are still free and still committing the sexual violence. So we would like to see all of them behind bars and held accountable for the crimes they committed against Congolese women.
So, Hawa Bangura in New York, I'd like to put that same question to you. Regardless of the verdict in this case, is this trial, the Minova trial, a step forward. Finally, a government has given in to pressure and has actually, whatever its flaws, has shown a form of justice being exercised, a form of accountability being demanded.
I think what we are seeing in the DRC, and which we all must agree, is that the government is making all effort to ensure that there is accountability. It's not only the Minova trial. I mean, the President Kabila himself, for the first time in October last year, made a statement that he's going to appoint a personal representative that is going to deal with the issue of sexual violence and children. Special police unit has been created in all police stations to work on the issue of violence against women and children. A special commission has been created by the Senate to actually ensure accountability and a change in the laws. The amnesty law that was passed, the excluded sexual violence and human rights violation, and now it is imbibed into their structure in which to make sure that people who have committed sexual violence and gross human rights violation are not recruited into the police and in the military. I think these are all steps that we have worked very closely with the government to make sure that the government takes into consideration in developing a framework that will ensure that what has happened in the past does not happen. We have a focal point for the first time in the Ministry of Defense that is working with us after the incident of Minova and the discussion I had, followed the discussion I had with the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Defense Staff, when the FARDC was going in confrontation with the M23. After this, the experience we had with Minova, a command order was given to the military, and this was supported by President Kabila, that anybody who commits sexual violence will be held accountable and will be punished. And after that attack, the attack of the FARDC against the M23, we saw a reduction. We did not see a repeat of Minova. So the challenge, of course, is huge. We cannot say we go smiling and singing, but what we have to accept, there's been a difference in the DRC. It will take time. But I can assure you, with all the commitment we have and the effort and the people who are deployed and the mission, let us don't forget, the mission, the MONUSCO mission, the SRSG, is one of the biggest supporter on issues of sexual violence. We've even changing the structure of the mission to bring a more senior person at a D1 level that is going to be in the office of the SRSG to be working with all the government people to ensure that the issue of sexual violence is addressed for the first time in the DRC. And I think for that we have to be able to say we see as hope, a slimmer of hope, that for the first time in the DRC, the government is taking the issue of sexual violence very seriously. We put in continuous pressure. The Secretary General, I have sat at the meeting between the Secretary General and President Kabila, and where the Secretary General has made it explicitly clear to President Kabila that you must address sexual violence. He said it all the time. It's not just in one meeting here in New York as well as in Addis Ababa. So as far as I'm concerned, I think we're making inroads. The challenges are still huge because we have a lot of armed groups in the DRC, over 40 of them. We have foreign fighters who are in the soil of the DRC. And we have to try to engage those ones because for the first time again, as I repeat, last year when I gave my report to the Security Council, 50% of the sexual violence were being committed by the armed groups, the military and the police. In this year's report, we saw that it has reduced to 27%.
Well, if I may, at that stage, let's just pause. Apologies for interrupting Hawa Bangura, but let's just pause and take a look at the scale of the problem that is being dealt with. A UN report last month gave an insight into the wider problem in the DRC. It documented 3,645 victims of sexual violence between January 2010 and December 2013. The victims ranged in age from 2 to 80. 73% were women, 25% children, and 2% men. Just over half the rapes were committed by members of armed groups in eastern Congo. Soldiers and state agents were implicated in around 1 out of every 3 rapes. Brigid, Inder, devastating figures to hear in that kind of calculated way. But the point that toZainab Bangura brought up, and the point revealed in that UN report, that 2/3 of those committing these crimes are, in fact, men in uniform, men accountable to a government.
Yes, and I think that's very concerning, and I would suggest that those figures are rightly conservative. So when in doubt, they've gone for a more conservative figure. But I would suggest probably the real figures are a little higher than that. These sorts of reports are very important because whatever the figure, it is a huge problem in the DRC, as in other countries around the world. But as our focus is the DRC today, my own organisation has been working in the DRC since 2006, and in our time we have documented over 700 incidents and interviews with victim survivors of sexual violence, all of whom are seeking accountability. And many of whom have indicated that the alleged perpetrators are indeed from the FARDC. I think some of the challenges here have been the earlier peace agreements and the process of integrating militia combatants into the Congolese army and to the Congolese police force. And I think at that time, in 2009, that there was inadequate retraining. There was inadequate vetting of combatants prior to their integration. There was an inadequate checking process to evaluate whether any of the combatants being integrated into the formal security services had ever committed war crimes or crimes against humanity in the past, including acts of rape and sexual slavery. But I do think there is perhaps some progress. I think in terms of the legal framework it is in place, but there's the implementation issue. This isn't the first case. I want to say there was a Baraka trial with a conviction in 2011, and this was a very important trial, with a conviction of a lieutenant colonel of the Congolese army, the most senior military figure ever to be convicted for crimes against humanity for acts of rape. And it was an attack on a village and a number of women raped on a New Year's Day attack committed by a unit of the FARDC. So while this is occurring, and we suggest that it may well be occurring by units with a higher proportion of former militia combatants than those who were trained formally in the professional, formal, disciplined army of the Congolese army. And where that issue isn't addressed, I think we're going to continue to see this. But I think there are signs of responses from both the army itself as well as from the government. But the more structured, the more disciplined, and the more formalised the army is, I think the better it will be in complying with its national and international obligations to comply with the rule of law.
Well, Victoria Dimandja, the situation is very complex in a way. We are talking about the majority of people who commit these crimes are men in uniform. Rape itself, though, is endemic, not only in the DRC, but in many other parts of the world as well. But in terms of dealing with the issue in the DRC, who ultimately has the accountability? The leaders of the army, the leaders of the police, or the government that engages or attempts not to engage in conflict? Surely the root cause of this is conflict itself. That is the cause that needs to be addressed in order for everything else to begin to be ameliorated. Your view on that?
What we've seen here for the last 20 years is that the Congolese government has been unable to protect its population, unable to protect its borders. So as long as the weak government in DRC is unable to protect its borders, and as long as the armed groups are able to prosper from illicit network on trading in minerals, the Congolese, the Eastern Congo, the whole country will still be a battlefield, and innocent civilians will be paying the tragically high price, especially women and children. So the first to be held accountable is the government, which his main role is to protect its population. And then the army, which army are we talking here? Because we know that there were elements from Rwanda and Uganda who have been integrated in the Congolese army. So we call them the Congolese army because they wear Congolese uniform. But we know that there are elements from Rwanda and Uganda who have been perpetrating all those sexual violence. And today, everybody is doing it. Even their Congolese colleagues are doing it because of the impunity.
Well, let's just pause once again and refer to something that was mentioned a bit earlier. In 2008, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1820, as we heard, in part as a response to the conflict in the DRC. It declared that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. Well, Amnesty International has said that rape and sexual abuse are not just a byproduct of war, but used as a deliberate military strategy. The last century offers numerous examples. Rapes by Japanese soldiers during the occupation of the Chinese city of Nanking in 1937, when an estimated 300,000 people were killed. The rape of an estimated 200,000 women during the battle for Bangladeshi independence in 1971. The systematic rape of women and girls in Bosnia as part of a strategy of ethnic cleansing. And during the Rwandan genocide, after which up to 10,000 war babies were born as a result of rape. Now, Hawa Bangura, the UN Secretary General, recently released his report for the year looking into the incidence of rape in conflict around the world. And he shows 21 countries where incidents of violence against women are happening on a daily basis. He identified 34 armed groups, militia and soldiers involved in these crimes. Now, this is a massive scale, is it not? Moving beyond the DRC to another 20 countries that have been identified as places where this is happening.
It's a global problem. It's one of the crimes that is as old as war itself. Unfortunately, it was always on the margins of international peace and security. It was only with the passing of Resolution 1820 in 2008 that the international community itself recognized for the first time that this is an international peace and security. And in 2009, my office was created to provide the international leadership, global leadership. It was only 2010 that the Security Council made a decision that we should be listing, identifying, monitoring, analyzing, and reporting people who are committing sexual violence group. And that's the reason why we had this report. And as a result of that, that's why the global advocacy, which is being undertaken by the British Foreign Secretary, to make sure that countries make a commitment around the world and to ensure that people who commit this crime cannot hide any longer. Wherever they are, whoever they are, they should be prosecuted, not only by the international community through the ICC, but within the countries. And this is the reason why in my office we have the team of experts on sexual violence in conflict and rule of law. We're working with national government to look at their constitution. You will be surprised that in some countries, as I speak to you, sexual violence in conflict is not a crime. So we're identifying countries out of those 21 countries where the laws can still allow perpetrators to go free, to try to reinforce the law, to try to train the police, to be able to investigate and protect the evidence, and to try to make sure that these people are prosecuted. It's a daunting task, but I think for us, the important issue is that it has been recognized around the world that it's a crime, that it's no longer a byproduct of war. It's not inevitable. If it is committed, whoever committed will be prosecuted. So there is a sense of accountability.
Well, let's go directly to Brigid Inder on that particular point very briefly. We heard the statement that violence against women is an international peace and security issue. It's only been so for the past 6 years, despite decades in which it was a systematic form of violence and aggression. 6 years in which that resolution has been in place. Is it having an impact? Very quickly.
Well, I think actually it's a slightly better story than that, which is that the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court recognised a range of sexual violence acts as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and where the other elements are satisfied also as forms of genocide. So it has been with us in the statute since 2002. I think the more momentum around this, both domestically and internationally, that we can generate both through the UK Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative, the work of the ICC, the day-to-day investigations of the International Criminal Court, and of course the domestic courts is critical. The volume of this, as you've outlined so clearly, is too large for the UN alone or for a country alone. It really is a coordinated international, domestic and regional issue. And the more that we can reinforce domestically international standards and apply in the international court the very real needs of victims calling for justice, I think this issue will begin to move forward.
Well, at that point, my thanks to our guests, toZainab Hawa Bangura, Victoria Dove Dimandja and Brigid Inder. And please do add your voice to this discussion. You can follow the story at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And on Twitter, send your comments to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.